Hello, everybody. This is our final webinar for our community partners data standards development. And so for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a series of webinars describing some data and metadata standards that are being developed by several people within the Earth Systems Science space for different types of data that are being generated by this program. So for today, we will have Amy Goldman from PNNL, as well as Kristin Boye from SLAC, describing different types of water data standards. And so the first is about hydrological monitoring, and the second one is about water quality that is being measured using sample analysis. So just so everybody knows, these webinars are all being recorded and they will be put up on our website. So, you know, for those of you who know people who weren't able to make it, they will be able to view this off our website. So with that, I want to hand it over to Amy first, who will be talking about this water level and other hydrological monitoring data standards.
Excellent. I'm just gonna get my screen going. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, can everyone see my screen? And it looks like a normal slide.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, excellent. Yes, so as Char said, I am working on hydrologic monitoring standards. So that basically just means when you have a sensor, you putting into water and measuring things in situ. So we're looking at specific parameters just to kind of keep things contained. And so we started with just what we thought were the most common parameters for people. So water level, which is a broad term in and of itself, temperature, electrical conductivity, specific conductivity, dissolved oxygen, and pH. So we went about this the same way that the other community funds projects went about things. We looked at existing repositories and data producers and the standards that they were using, and created a draft standard. And since then, we've been having a series of discussions with various people, all of the SFAs and universities and whatnot, to go through our draft and improve it iteratively. So we very much want to keep having those discussions. So if you have any thoughts on this standard and want to engage about it, or if you know of other people who would be interested, please reach out. My email is on that slide, amy.goldman@pnnl.gov. The conversations that we've had so far have been really, really valuable. And so very much want to keep having those. So with that, the standard itself has 7 components that we'll go through. So there's a Readme file, just basic, and then there is a list of required fields and a list of optional fields. Those are kind of like very meaty pieces. We won't look at them in their entirety. We'll go through the fields, but we won't look at those files. But they contain the definitions for the fields, the formats, examples, things of that nature. Then we have a list of recommended vocabulary, and then 3 templates: data file template, sensor file template, and terminology file template. So what the user ends up creating are 3 files: a data file, sensor file, and terminology file. They can end up having more than those 3 files because they can have multiple data files that go with a single sensor file and a single terminology file, or they can have multiples of all of these within a data package. It kind of depends how people want to organize things. But with what's within these broadly, the data file has the data from the sensor. The sensor file has metadata about the sensor and the location that it was deployed, things like make, model, and the lat long. And then the terminology file is where all of the fields are defined. So all of the column headers are defined there. Any missing value terms that are used, data flags, all of that is defined in the terminology file, which gives a lot of flexibility to the standard. So we'll go through each of these parts pretty quickly, but if we'll have time for questions, and then if you want to discuss in more detail, as I said, reach out. But the Readme file has a lot of critical details. We'll just talk through these super fast. It obviously goes over the 3-file system that I just described, and the fact that the terminology file is where everything must be defined. All of the column headers should be machine readable, so no special characters except for periods and underscores, no spaces in the headers, and no empty cells in the files. And then the fact that parameters and fields that are outside of the scope of this standard, that list of parameters that I went through, those can absolutely be contained within the data package. If people measured, nitrate, go for it, include it here. We just didn't cover that. And then we are not requiring specific column headers. They are suggested, and the suggestions are in the recommended vocabulary file as well as the units. And that gives a lot of flexibility to people. We're able to do that because of the terminology file. And the thinking behind that was if people have historical data sets with sensor information for decades, which does exist absolutely, and they don't want to be changing their column headers or changing that kind of setup, then they don't have to do that. They just need to explain what they have. So yes, already mentioned the multiple data files, and then data from multiple sensors can be included in a single data file as long as there's only one date time column, and obviously none of the column headers can be repeated within the data file. So that's pretty straightforward. And then we don't require any kind of additional documentation like sensor specs, codes, or other documents, but we definitely encourage people to include that. We just haven't specified information about it. And then lastly, this is kind of a more detailed point, but the fields for location I mentioned are in the sensor file. So you have information about your sensor, and then it says, the lat long and other things. But for the purpose of this, let's just say lat long. So that's where it's listed. So that is assuming inherently that your data file has a sensor that really isn't moving much. Maybe it moves a couple times, but it's not the primary thing that's varying as your data varies or as the time stamps change. If instead you do have a location that's varying throughout your data set, for example, if you're holding a sensor and walking to different points in a river, you can absolutely have the location fields in the data file instead of the sensor file. That's fine. So that is what broadly is in the Readme file. And now we are going to go through the different required and optional fields. So as I said, we'll go through those using the templates. And again, it will be sort of speedy. So just here's all of them at once, because I think some people's brains probably immediately are like, oh, did you include this? Did you include that? So I just wanted to put it up on the screen. The required fields are in red, and of course the fields are divided among the 3 different templates that we have. So now we'll step through them in actual detail. So the data file only has one field that's required. It's the date time field. The other columns here are just like measurement columns that are made up for the purposes of this. And that date time column can be formatted a couple different ways. It can have, it can be separate date and separate time. It can also be a start date and a start and an end time. And then it just has to have a couple different requirements. So it cannot switch to daylight savings time within a file. Definitely not, don't want that. And then we do suggest that people use UTC. But if they decide to instead use their local time zone format, that would just be defined in the terminology file again. So still has that flexibility. For the optional fields, so for these slides, the required fields will be shaded when we get to the optional fields. So shaded in blue, we have the date time in UTC. And then the optional fields, optional is having a local date time column. So if they want to keep with our standard and have the UTC timestamp, they can also still have their local time if that's helpful for them. And then here are just some example parameters, specific connectivity and water temperature, so that you can see the format that we're suggesting for the column headers. We do suggest having units in the column headers and having the different parts separated with periods. And then optional also are data flags and notes. And the data flags can be structured however the user wants. There's an example there. Those are defined again in the terminology file, so it's very much up to the user. They can also have multiple data flag columns if they want to have, one per parameter or something like that. And then the notes field is just free text, anything. And you can see the NAs here. Again, that there can't be any empty cells, and so NA is what's being used to fill those for text fields. So now for the sensor file. We tried to really limit the number of fields that would be required for the sensor file. We know that at the moment, many people do not put really any information about their sensor out with their data. And so adding any at all would kind of be a lift for them. And so we wanted to make sure we included what is critical, but not kind of overdo it too much. So what we have right now, we have this first column, column header column, and that is how we're linking together the data file and the sensor file. So what's in this example cell here is the actual column header from the column of data that's in the data file that we looked at. And that column of data used the sensor that's in this row of sensor information. So it's just that column header there. And then the other required fields, sensor make and model, because if a user is coming to the data newly and wants to publish about it, they're going to need that information for like methods section. Also, it allows them to then look up additional information about the sensor that the person who created the data package may not have wanted to include. And then it has kind of very basic location information. So we have lat long, and then deployment environment is essentially what water body did you deploy your sensor in. So in this example, it's groundwater. We are suggesting that people use a controlled vocabulary for this, the ENVO controlled vocabulary. And so it's super easy to use. You go on the website, you type in basically anything, and they have tons and tons of options. We include a couple in the standard and also listed a few here. You can see like freshwater river, lake, etc. And that just has the term and then this code associated with it. And then sensor context is just kind of one level of detail more. So you know what water body someone deployed their sensor in, but kind of like how did they go about it? So in this case, they deployed in a well. We have a controlled vocabulary that we created, and that's in the recommended vocabulary file. We did that because we couldn't find an existing one that covered the information that we wanted. But it has options like piezometer, buoy, maybe it's handheld or attached to a boat, things of that nature. So then there are quite a lot of optional fields for the sensor file. It's split across 2 slides. So again, the required fields are shaded in green. And the optional fields, we have a start date time, stop date time. And so that allows you to indicate if something has changed with the sensor. So maybe you switched out a sensor in the middle of your data file. So you can indicate that that specific row of information stopped at a certain time point. And then you can have a new row of information that starts at a certain time point. And maybe, for example, only the serial number changed, because it's the same sensor in the same location. And then we have basic information, serial number, accuracy, and range. That's all coming from the manufacturer. And then the sensor calibration, and then we'll skip over one to QA/QC. Those two are both free text fields. We wanted people to have the ability to talk about what they did for calibration and QA/QC, but people report all sorts of different information about those fields. And so they're free text. People can write something really brief, or they can point to a document that's in the data package that explains what they did, or they can point to different references, links, maybe the manufacturer's guidance, anything like that. And then the one we skipped over, measurement interval, you can indicate what type of interval. So in this case, fixed, maybe it was event generated, and in this case, 15 minutes. So then some more optional fields. We have sensor pairing. And so that is if you have two sensors where the data can be analyzed together, or more than two sensors. The most common reason for this would be if two sensors are co-located, two different types of sensors. So we have the ability for people to indicate that there. And then sensor notes is just free text field, anything can be written there. And then we have sensor context notes, which is specifically notes about the sensor context field, which we talked about. In this case, we had well for the sensor context. And so sensor context notes is just a little more detail in a free text way. So in this case, secured from the well casing to 10 meters depth. Maybe if it's a river, you're talking about how far out into the river you went, or the elevation, or whatever other information. And then we just have the water body name, site name, and the institution that deployed the sensor. And so that brings us to the terminology file. So again, all the terms that are used have to be defined, and the required fields are just term and definition, super straightforward. Here I have one of the column headers that we used, and again, it's just the most kind of specific definition possible. We've even written out the units. And then we have the missing text fields here because they were used in the other examples. So we have missing text as NA, and then missing values, this -9999. So then for the optional fields, we have two of them. There's recommended term. And so that is for if a user has decided not to use a column header that we have suggested, but the term that they did use can map directly to one that we suggested, they would indicate that here. So for example, they decided to use COND to indicate specific conductivity. We recommended this other term, but they are identical, same units, everything. And so they list that here. If there isn't a term that maps directly, then it would just be whatever empty value format that you're using. So in this case, NA. And then this last field here, location file name, that is to indicate where the different terms were used. And so if you have, for example, two data files and one of them uses the COND term and the other file uses the SPC term, you can indicate which file uses which one. So we went through those very quickly. Just going to show them all at once again. But yeah, happy to go into more detail about any of those or talk about them at another time if you'd like to. So then that just leaves us with the list of recommended vocabulary for that 7th piece of the standard. We've already kind of covered what's in it, but just to take a look again, the setup is it has a table with the terms that we are recommending, their definitions, and then additional notes about them. So to again use specific conductivity as an example, it has this definition, and then the notes say that, if a user decides to use a different term, then they have to specify that it's specific conductivity, not electrical conductivity, which is something that people often forget to do. And it also reminds them not to use special characters when using micro. So that is how the column headers and sort of other recommended terms are set up. And then also in that file, we have our controlled vocabulary for that sensor context field. So we already covered a lot of examples for that, but that is just where that list lives. So, one last point. The Water level terms are also, of course, listed here for the recommended terms that we have. We have quite a few of them. They are definitely more complex than the other more basic, like specific conductivity temperature parameters. Different disciplines use different terms. Terms that seem the same are defined differently. There's a lot of complexity there. And so we have currently quite a lot of terms, and we're still developing that list. If you have specific opinions about water level terms, please reach out. Love to hear your thoughts. Those conversations have definitely been super important. So yes. And then the next steps, just more community conversations and feedback, as I've said. We're doing a few pilot applications with the standard from projects that have requested using it. We're finalizing the water level terms, as I said, and then also just verifying compliance with other community fund standards, like the CSV standard, for example. And so to wrap up, again, final time, please reach out. Ideas, questions, concerns. You want to talk how this applies to your data or maybe doesn't apply. Really want to make sure that this is meeting your project's needs, or someone might have an opinion. Feel free to send my information to them. But yeah, the more community input, the better. So that's all I have. Oh, Chari, you're muted.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Amy. That was great. And we'll reserve questions to the end if that's okay, so Kristin can get through her standard. But while we're transitioning, Kristin, feel free to share your screen. We could take a quick question if someone has it. Okay, since we didn't get anyone to unmute quickly enough, we'll just charge ahead, let Kristin finish, and then we'll take a joint Q&A at the end.
All right. I guess you're all seeing my screen, and can you also hear me well enough?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Okay, so thanks, Amy, for leading the way, because I think a lot of what you'll see for my standard is you're going to sort of recognize from Amy's. So I've been working on developing a standard for chemical concentrations in water, soil, and sediment samples. And just like Amy, I am still working on, or I'm earlier stages in terms of getting feedback. So I put links to the folder that has all of the documents in a Google Drive in the chat window, along with a feedback form that you could fill out if you have specific feedbacks. And I've also created a questionnaire where I'd love to hear back from people. It shouldn't take that long to fill out. So please go check that out and feel free to do that. Also follow along while I talk. And then any thoughts and concerns additionally, please email me and let me know if you want to discuss further. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I'm not able to advance my slide. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I just found this quote, and I thought I'd put it in just as a motivator for why we should do this whole work of standardizing our data and metadata, because I think there's some people understand it intuitively, but some people may feel like it's a lot of work. But I think it's really important, and it's how we can make our data grow, but it's also how we can help ourselves manage our data better, and that in the long run will be helpful. So the scope of my standard is basically targeting the sort of routine types of measurements that are commonly done in water, soil, and sediment samples. So the flow for this is a little different from Amy's standard because these are data that comes from samples that have been collected in the field. And so they have already been through, or should already have been through, the sample metadata standard. So they should have a registered sample ID and follow all of the requirements for the sample metadata standard that Joan has been developing. And so then they've been taken to the lab and run through some sorts of analyses, ICP, IC, DA, you name it. And so then the next step is to deposit that data in ESS-DIVE, and before that is where this standard comes in. So this is standardizing how that data is presented and how it is, and what metadata is required and recommended to include. And so that can be for raw data coming straight off the instrument, or it can be for any down the stream types of data. If you've done QA and QC, or if you've done some averaging or other statistics with your data, that's all fine. It just needs to be recorded. And so the data package for these types of data will look a little different from Amy's, but I think you'll see it's pretty similar still. So first of all, like I said, there is a step first where you have registered your sample, or you have a sample metadata file where your sample metadata is recorded, and that's what Joan's been working on developing. And so now, and then you have your data files for whatever analyses you've run on those samples. And then just like Amy, I've decided to split it up in 3 parts. And so basically there is a methods file, so that would be corresponding to the sensor file in Amy's standard. And that's basically, as I see it, as a library of all of your methods, or could be, at least you could have one file with all of the different methods that you regularly use, and then you could just reuse that and package it into any data package. And then there is also a terminology file, very much like Amy's, and that's sort of the dictionary where you provide translations and explanations for all the terminology that you use. And obviously this standard builds on that compliance with all of the above level standards like package file, CSV, and sample metadata standards. And just like Amy's standard, there is in the folder, there are 7 components. There is a Readme file, there's a list of required and optional fields, there's a file with recommended vocabularies, and then there's the data file template, method file template, and terminology file template. And the templates are, you don't have to use them. They are just meant as guides for if you want to comply with the standard, it's recommended to use the templates because it will automatically make you comply, or make your files comply with the standard. But you are free to organize your data differently if that works better. And so this is an overwhelming overview, but just like Amy, I'm showing here all of the required fields in orange, and then the optional fields are in black. And so in my case, or in this case, the data file is going to be the one that has the most fields, just because there is a lot of metadata that needs to sort of be packaged up with the data, so it's not, it doesn't get separated from it. And the first 3 fields are directly imported, or should be the same as for the sample metadata. So that's the sample ID and sample name and material. That's all in the sample metadata file, but I've decided to include it, or for now I'm including it as a guide for people that may not care too much about, if you're pulling out the data and you just want to know sort of, is it soil, and then have that data directly in the data file. So I'll also go through quickly sort of all of these different things. And oh, I should say, so these are the required and optional fields that we recommend. And the way that they can be organized is sort of up to the user, because I've come to realize that people like to organize their data in many different ways. And also all of the standards that I've looked at have different ways of organizing data. So For example, you could have your variables in columns, or you could have them in rows. So for example, the WQX standard, the EPA standard, has one row for each variable for each sample. And then they have the metadata. So most of the metadata, at least, are then in columns. So there is a lot of columns for each sample and each variable. And then they also have this method separated into a separate file. But then there's also a question of how do you want to separate out your metadata details, and what level of separation do you want to do to help facilitate the reuse of your data. Because if you have long paragraphs of text where you might have described all of the, or you might have included all of the required information, it is very hard for people to automatically pull that data or that metadata out and that information out. And so one could think about ways to split that up to help help the end users find that data or that metadata easier. So for that reason, I've sort of gone a little midway. So I started out using the WQX as a template, but I moved away from the, so this is now the data file template. So this is not required to use, but it's recommended that you use it. And so in the current version, and I'd very much like to have feedback from people about this. But so what I've done is I've decided to have the variables, so the measurements in columns. And so you'll see here that there are 10 header rows, so that might seem a little overwhelming. But it was suggested to me, and I like that idea to do this because then you keep some of the really important metadata together with the data. And so the first header row is basically the name. So you have the sample ID, the sample name, the material, and then you have your variables. And the variables are going to have be specific names, of course. And then for each variable, there is a data flag column that's optional. And there is also a notes column that's also optional. And then for each variable, there'll be required fields or required information. So you have to report the unit, you have to report the basis of that unit. So I'll talk a little bit more about and give examples of what that means. You don't have to report your preservation method or preparation method, but you do have to report your analysis method, the analysis detection limit, the precision, and then the data status. So for example, if you're submitting raw data, that should be noted. If it's been processed, it should be, there should be information about how it's been processed and what kind of QA/QC has been done. So this is now an example of what this might look like for nitrite and nitrogen measurements. So there is a unit, which is milligram per liter, and then the unit basis is as nitrogen, not as nitrate or as nitrite, which it could be, but you have to specify that. And then there is some information here about how the sample has been stored, how it's been treated or prepared before the analysis. Then there is an analysis method ID, which needs to be unique within each data package, but it doesn't need to be unique, globally unique. But I will come to that later, that we do recommend that you register your methods, and you could create a globally unique method and persistent IDs for them. And then there is the detection limits and the precision, and those must be in the same units as the measurements. And then there's, in this case, it's averaged data. So there is a data processing method. And then there is some sort of data status report. And all of these terms should be reported then in the terminology file or in the methods file, depending on where it makes most sense. I mean, the method IDs should be described in the method files, and the other codes that are used should be described in the terminology file. And so for the methods file, I'm just showing an example here. There are a lot more fields in the template. Only the ones that are shaded in green are required. So you have to have a method ID. You have to specify what type of method that is. And then you have to have a description of the method, and also note which lab this method was, or the measurements were conducted in, or where this method is used. And so, like I said, you could consider registering your methods. There is, for example, this protocols.io, where you can get DOIs for your methods, or you can register them any other way where you get unique and persistent identifiers, or you can just make up your own method IDs, as I've done in this example here. The idea is that you could create this methods file for all sorts of different types of methods. So you could have your sampling methodology here. You could have other methods included in the same file. And so basically that's how you build, that's my note of this being sort of like a library. So you can have your whole method library in one file and just include it. As long as you have unique method IDs for everything in your files, then you can just include it for each data package where any of those methods are used, and call in what methods by using their IDs in the data files. And so that way it's a bit of work to put this together the first time, but over time, as long as you keep using the same methods or just modify them slightly, you just need to update it with any new methods and any modifications, and therefore it should be pretty, over time, it should be pretty easy to keep it updated and not as much work. And so I've also, the optional fields here are an example of how you could split out, like I was saying, you can split out some of the metadata information so that it's easier for the people that want to look at your data to understand specifics about your samples. So for example, it could be important to know what temperature the method's been run at. In some cases, it's important if it was in the dark or if it was just in the light. Sometimes it's important to know if it was in air or if it was anoxic or if there was any other types of atmosphere. For say soil extractions or things like that, it's important to know, it could be important to know if the soil was dry or if it was field moist, if it was at a certain water holding capacity. So you can include that. And if you are doing any sort of dilutions or extractions, it's important to note what kind of medium was used. And then for, say, extractions, again, the time of the extractions could be also put down separately. And then if there is a publication, or if you're using a standardized method, for example, an EPA method, you can put a reference to that, and then you can also include an instrument and that's recommended if you've used an instrument for your method. But if it's a preservation method, then maybe it's not, then it's not relevant. And I should say also, just like for Amy's standard, should be no empty cells, and so you need to have a missing or a not missing data value for all cells that do not have any information. And the terminology file is almost exactly identical, I think, to Amy's. So it's, again, two required fields, the terms and the definitions. And then, just like Amy said, if you are using a term that is not what's been recommended in the standard, but there is a direct translation, we recommend that you note that down to help translations between different types of data files. And again, you can also note which files in the data package that these terms are used in. And so in this standard, I am not requiring that all of the terminology for like the headers and things are noted if they are if they follow the recommended vocabularies or what's noted in the standard. But if you deviate from that, then you will have to report what the terms are and define them. You have to define your missing data value both for numericals and text, even if you use the ones that are recommended in by the standard. And again, this is like a dictionary, so you can collect all of your terms that you use in any kind of data, for any kind of data if you want to, and reuse it for other data packages or other types of data as well. And so finally, for the recommended vocabularies for this standard, we don't request any controlled vocabulary. We do recommend this to follow these vocabularies. And so it's, there's a long list of what variables can be called. And the list that I have put together is based off of the CSIRO standard. That's the top link in this vocabulary file. But I've modified it to comply with the CSV standard, and also made sure there is that just seems to have most of the types of measurements that I could think people might want to include in this kinds of data file packages. But it may not have everything, so you can add things, or you can, if you prefer a different vocabulary source, I've included links to others where you can look for controlled vocabularies that may be more appropriate for your variables that you want to report. Or you can just use your whatever name you normally use and then provide in the terminology file a definition of that. And the same with the units. So throughout the standard, I've been using camel case for everything. So write everything out and just capitalize any consecutive words. That's not required. But again, if you use a different way of reporting your units, you need to specify that in the terminology file. That's basically the outline of this standard. It's, as you see, it's piggybacking off both Joan's standard and Amy's standard. So thank you both a lot, especially Amy, for leading the way and letting me steal your templates and stuff and modify them. But I want to say that this standard is still very much in progress. And so I'm strongly looking for people that want to provide feedback. So please, at the very least, if you work with this kind of data and want to have a say, then please at the very least fill out the questionnaire. That'll be 5 to 10 minutes after you take a look through the standard templates and standard requirements. But much more I would prefer to discuss with you and talk with you so that I can get a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work, and how you're using or how you're organizing this kinds of data at the moment, so that this standard can be useful for everybody, both for those who already have a way of organizing this data and a good data management procedure, so that it'll work without too much additional work, but hopefully also with the templates and the standard, it will be really, I'm hoping that they should be helpful for people that maybe currently don't have a standardized way of organizing their data and that are looking for ways to do that. So I want to hear from all of you. I also want to hear from data users, what would be helpful to include or not include, or how to organize it so that it works for people that want to download the data and work with it on the other side of things. So please, just like Amy, just please fill out the survey, put in comments on the Google Doc that I linked to, or email me, or put down your email and I'll reach out to you to set up a time to discuss. And we really do rely on you guys to help us out so that this works for everybody as well as possible. And with that, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you, Kristin. This was also fantastic work. And this should be very broadly applicable to a number of our projects. Just a couple of quick comments before we switch to questions. Both Amy and Kristin alluded to it, but both of them have had to research existing standards in order to develop these standards. So for instance, you saw Kristin referring to the WQX EPA standard. Amy's looked very extensively across a number of other groups, including the USGS, in developing their standards. So that we have incorporated a lot of existing work in this space, but we're trying to make these more friendly for our ESS scientists so that they are have a low barrier to reporting in these formats. So that's been a very major criteria for us, is that it gets used by our community, which is really why we need all this feedback. So the second comment is that we're going to be developing a GitHub repository for all these standards, and that will also be an avenue to provide feedback down the lane. So our next webinar actually will feature how that GitHub is structured and how you can provide feedback. That'll be done by Rob, Crystal Ornelas, who's one of our new postdoc, and Joan will also be wrapping up with her final sample standard that we're pretty close to finalizing in the next webinar. So with that, let's just take questions. We have about 10 minutes for Kristin and Amy.
Hi, Kristin, Amy, it's Danielle from LBL. Thanks both for your talks. I'm gonna ask a question from a user perspective. I think it's great to have so much flexibility for the data providers. As a user, I would look at this and be like, oh gosh, how am I gonna synthesize these data if I'm pulling kind of multiple data sets with allowing the users to, especially if the mapping column, the mapping column and maybe even the file names are optional. So I was curious of what you envision, how you envision maybe thinking about synthesizing across data packages, given that a lot of what I think might be needed to map that data is optional.
Kristin, you can jump in. Yeah, I think that my thought was that at the very least, the sort of terminology file would guide that, and that having the mapping term column optional or having it required would end up being more of an issue when people completely deviate, I guess. But it's definitely an open discussion for me. So if you think that that is a field that should be required instead of optional, then I'm certainly open to that and kind of like to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just think, I think if we want to, I mean, even with it, I think it definitely should be required. And if they don't have a mapping, then you would just put none, and their data kind of maybe goes off into Neverland because it can't, or just, the reuse possibilities are much less because it's going to take a huge effort to like synthesize it, but at least it would force people to try to you know, at least we have a chance. And I'm thinking programmatically, because eventually you would think about maybe writing parsers or, you know, translators, and you're gonna have to have that, you know, like if you can, with your format that's kind of standardized in terms of the metadata collection, I could see a way to write that. But if that data just is not there, then it's, that metadata is not there. It's, you're kind of, it's really difficult.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we want to have a way. So right now, the way that it's set up is the term has to match exactly, which includes units, because our recommended terms include units. So I'm wondering if we want to find a way to sort of separate that so that the chances of matching increase, but then there's like some way to indicate, oh, but the units are different, to at least make it so that not all of the data floats off into nowhere if there are pieces that can still work together. But that's something I'll have to think through more.
I like that approach of separating. That was another point I was going to mention for consideration. Because it seems like you could have a variable that matched, but if the units don't, then you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
I'll just second all of that. I don't feel like I have anything really to add to what you guys just said, but thanks, Danielle. That's a good point.
I have a question. I guess it's not necessarily specific to these two standards, but this idea of templates has been brought up, and I'm wondering whether this is what people's thoughts are on what formats those templates should be. Are we going to be posting these up as like Excel or Google Docs, or something that's a bit more, has a bit more longevity?
My plan is obviously right now it's in Google Docs, and that's mostly just so like it's easier to discuss, the formatting being nice, but my plan is to have them in CSVs.
Yeah, they would have to be at least, I mean, I guess they would be probably, I would probably have them as both, just for whatever people prefer, but definitely we'll have them as CSVs.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I can use, because I was wanting to make templates that have like drop-down options for the fixed vocabulary, and I'm a bit stuck on how to do that.
Yeah, that would be nice. I have no idea how to do that either.
Yeah, we've tried to do that in Excel for some of our templates for other projects. And I think the challenge with Excel is just that it's proprietary. The formats keep changing. It's not necessarily backwards compatible. So we, you know, for the long term. So I think maybe the direction you guys are headed in, where you have a separate file with the terminologies for dropdowns, I think that's what Ameriflux also follows.
Yeah, we don't have any, well, right, sorry. Ameriflux currently does actually have Excel files, but we're definitely moving away from it. We didn't have any of that kind of fancier functionality built in. They were basically separate tabs, so they could function as CSV files, just 3 separate CSV files. And I would say, like, on the projects that we did try to have, like the drop-down menus with controlled vocabulary, it's really easy to corrupt those files. And so we had problems, kind of, people send it around and then like somehow links get broken, and it's kind of a nightmare to maintain. And then I think just maybe a final nail in the coffin, so you are very aware of my opinion, is that I think that you know, as we're moving away into more cloud-based stuff, like not everyone's buying Microsoft stuff anymore. So I'm wondering in the future, like, it's going to become, you know, there'll still be a handful of people that use it, but it might not be the like go-to choice in the future, especially with, you know, people got to pay for it. So I don't know, just some thoughts.
Yeah, another thing that I've thought of including is having the CSV and then having a PDF version of the fancy one, just to kind of make it clearer in people's minds what things are supposed to look like, and like color coding and whatnot. without including the Excel. But yeah, lots of ways to go about that.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I like the idea of the hard-coded PDF as an example, because I think it's that accessibility and knowing what to put where is a part of a challenge for getting people to fill in a really vanilla looking CSV. And also getting the right, if you're going to have a fixed vocabulary, then for people to actually use it.
So Deb here, I guess I have a question, because the main other format that people seem to consider sort of a baseline is potentially working from R. And I guess I'm curious what you guys think about whether an option, instead of the option being Excel or CSV, I'm wondering whether it makes some sense to think about R or CSV or, or something, having R somewhere in that mix. What do you guys think about that? Is that universally used, or are you guys feeling like, no, that's also pretty boutique?
I mean, I think a lot of people do use R. I would not know how to go about making that, but
Yeah, same goes for me, but I would be definitely interested to hear more about the options there and think through what might be best for people. When I think about CSVs, I just think that, like any user would definitely know how to interact with that. But if R is widely enough applied in this type of case, then it could certainly be worth adding as well.
Great. So we are at time, so I do want to wrap up here. There are, again, a number of options for providing feedback. Everybody really wants to hear from all our projects. They've already been talking one-on-one to people we've been telling them to talk to, but we really want everybody to chime in here. So thanks. This webinar is recorded. It will be up on our website. So feel free to share the link with people you think might be interested in this and provide feedback on this. And our next webinar will be in September on the GitHub for the standards as well as the final sample standards. So thanks, everybody.